It's January again. In fact, we're actually almost halfway through January already. And maybe some of you are beginning to wonder whether this year being different than last year might not be panning out just as we'd hoped. Maybe by the 14th of January, you're already beginning to think, well, 2019 might be that year where I get it all together. The creator of fitness apps tell us that January the 12th is the day you are most at risk of giving up that New Year's resolution to be more healthy. Because they can track what we're doing, they watch this spike on January the 1st. It carries through the first week. And by the end of the second week, most of us have decided that that's just not for us. And somewhere around about February, you look at your phone and think, what's that app even doing on there? I mean, is it that we just lack the ability to do what we say? Or is it that life just gets the better of us year after year? That life does what life does. So it's next year we'll deal with that. And maybe next year will be that year where I sort that out. You know, it's interesting because our minds are these fascinating things that have the ability to dream and imagine and hope that things could be different, that next year will be different from this year, that this decision is something I can actually do. We're programmed with the ability to desire that, but so often unable to actually see how to make it so. So we return to this series, which we began last year, talking about the things which trouble our minds. And we use this title, Ghosts Upon the Earth, because for some of us that perhaps don't know the literature reference that we've stole it from, we actually do feel like we're kind of floating around the earth, kind of like ghosts, present but not really in control. And so, in the way our teaching year has gone so far, we begin with the text, and unsurprisingly, the text is from Romans. In chapter 5 of Paul's great letter at verse 1, he begins like this. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. As a pastor, it's very difficult for me not to just pause at that verse there and suggest that this is possibly one of the most profound verses in Scripture. And if we could just wrestle with this verse alone in our own lives, many of us would see a difference, not just in our relationship with God, but in our relationship with the rest of the world, and perhaps with our relationship with ourselves. We have been justified through faith. We have peace with God. We have gained access into this grace in which we now stand. Many of the things that Paul talks about as things which have happened to us, for many of us, we talk about things we hope could be true. And Paul's often telling us they are already true. He continues, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Peace is a complex subject. For those of us, particularly with troubled minds, peace is an even more complex subject. We want to be in control of our lives. That for many of us, that's our desire. I want to be in control of my own goings-on. Those of us with troubled minds, people that struggle with anxiety and depression, sometimes actually that brings them a great clarity. We're not in control of our own lives. So little is actually in control if we're honest with ourselves. But our cultural perspective has it that control is so important and so possible, we tell ourselves on a regular basis, that we've come to believe that the solution to all of our problems is cure or solving them. We've got to solve this problem. We've got to fix that issue. We've got to cure this particular illness. But interestingly here, Paul talks about peace and grace, something we know we don't control if you've been listening to our journey so far this year. And peace for Paul, it seems, as you look at these verses here, peace is not the absence of difficulty. Peace is not the absence of conflict, or peace is not even the absence of suffering. For Paul, peace seems to be something about the way you can be in the midst of it all. When life is doing what life does, when the world is doing what the world does, Paul talks about peace. The writer David Karp, I have to say that carefully, when talking about his depression, said that it took him 2 decades to abandon the medical language of cure and instead take up the spiritual vocabulary of transformation. And so as we turn to this series again this year, my aim throughout the next 3 weeks is not to offer cure. I can't. I don't know that such a thing is often possible for many of the mental challenges that we journey with in our lives. But even if it was, I'm not qualified to offer it. But what I do want to do is talk from the perspective of care. Thomas More described it like this: care appreciates the mystery of human suffering and does not offer the illusion of a problem-free life. And many of us live under this illusion that the problem-free life is possible. And I'm not trying to be fatalistic, but I want to recognize that the call of the church is to journey together in our sufferings, is to journey with each other as we hope in Christ. And we know that Christ is with us and bringing us peace in the midst of everything. Think about it this way: if our responsibility is to cure, then we could only ever talk about things we've figured out. We could only ever discuss things that we had the answer to or the solution to. But if our role as a community, if our role to one another within Westside King's Church is to care, then we can talk about anything, even the most stigmatized of things, like what goes on beneath the surface, in that hidden world beyond conversations about jobs and recreation and family and errands that you have to run, that world of what goes on in our minds. But here's a confession to begin today with, a confession I'd love us all to make at some point. That there is no them and us when it comes to this conversation. And so often I've encountered in this sort of discussion, in the opening of conversations around our mental health, we so quickly drop into a way of thinking that says that's what other people struggle with. It's something that other people have problems with. And that's because our brains are pretty clever. Our brains are highly egotistical. You maybe have noticed this by now. And our egotistical brains have brilliant self-defense mechanisms. And what we do with these highly egotistical, self-defending brains is we convince ourselves that that could never happen to me. And our way of doing that is deciding that that's someone else's problem, not mine. This is despite the fact that 1 in 4 people in the modern Western world struggle with some sort of mental health challenges. And therefore, what we then start to do is we start to tweak and adjust our narrative. People with depression or anxiety or other mental health challenges, we say, well, the other person, they're just a bit lazy, or they're selfish. Or we say strange things about depressed people, like as if it's something they choose. What have they got to be depressed about? As if they decided, I'm going to be depressed now. That's what I'm going to take on. Look at all the money they've got. How could they be depressed? How could he do that to himself when he had everything going for him? We don't talk about other illness that particular way. But when it comes to our issues of our mental health, we kind of get awkward as to what to do about it. This could be because we actually don't really know much about our brains. Let's be honest. And that's just not something that your partner says to you. Put it this way, Dean Burnett says it like this: the brain, it messes about with memories. It jumps at shadows. It's terrified of harmless things. It screws with our diet, our sleeping, our movement. It convinces us we're brilliant when we're not. It makes us half the stuff we perceive. It gets us to do irrational things when emotional. It causes us to make friends incredibly quickly and turn on them in an instant. It's kind of a worrying list. Do you know what's really worrying about this list? That's what a normal brain does. That's a brain working properly. And then get this, none of us have the same brain. Like when you actually look at the way our lives have formed and the way our journey has been, all of our brains are physically different. There's no two the same, which leads to the question, what is normal? What's a normal brain look like? You know the answer to this is one other than yours. And most of us get by well with our weird idiosyncrasies. Most of us have these tics and quirks and eccentricities that we get along quite okay with, and nobody even knows that there's anything wrong with us until one day in casual conversation you mention you like the smell of purple, and you get a weird look and realize that, maybe my brain's not the same as everybody else's. But I want to cast a wide net this morning. Last year we talked about depression, anxiety, and the various spin-offs that can come alongside that. And in that conversation, it does still become easy for us to talk in categories of them and us. So as a result, if I ask the question this morning, are you depressed? A whole series of hesitations come along in your mind. Does he want me to put my hand up? Is it one of those sort of things? Will I have to come to the front? And if I do put my hand up, like, what will everybody else think? Have I talked to the people that maybe I'm not depressed. Maybe I'm just a little bit sad. I've been sad for a long time, but I'm not sure. And how will that affect me in my community? We get overloaded with thoughts about that question. But let me ask you a different question about your mental health. Who feels like they have a little too much to do? Who feels like there's got a little too much going on? Let me ask it. I see that hand. If you could just make a small donation to the number on the screen. Let me ask you a different question. If I ask you the question, how are you? Can you conceptualize an answer that doesn't involve responding initially with busy? Like it used to be when people asked us, how are you? We lied. I'm fine. But now, when people ask, how are you? Think about how many of your conversations begin with, I'm busy. How often that's the initial response is, how are we going to describe our lives? I've got so much going on. I can't believe that it's January already. I can't believe it's 2018 already. It just feels like yesterday we were celebrating the turn of the millennium. And that was a conversation I literally had last week. Or for those of you who are super chill with us today and you don't feel busy, let me ask you a question. Are you brave enough to admit that and not feel shame? Would you walk into your boss and say, not feeling overworked at the moment? Everything's in its right place. And here lies the narrative of the modern world. At some point in our lives, perhaps after we were told that getting good grades makes us a good person, we started to connect our self-worth to our achievements and began to pursue the life that society modeled for us. A life that suggests that what you need is just beyond where you are right now. And if you just push a little harder, if you just try a little more, if you just eke a little time from somewhere, you can get to that life. And that life of being, as Tom York says it, fitter, happier, more productive. There's no Radiohead fans in the room. Maybe that's another story. But the question is, how much fitter? How much happier? How much more productive? Leslie Jameson says it like this: the abiding myth of the self-made man comes attached to another article of faith, an insistence even, that every self-made man can sustain whatever self he has managed to make. And that's the lie that we find ourselves living in. I can do it on my own, and it's sustainable. It's achievable. It's sustainable. And we constantly live believing that the way our society models life for us is achievable, and you can sustain that once you get there. But here's the thing. We have documented evidence now. The research is clear on this. The higher the pressure to perform, the higher the pressure to achieve and sustain it, the greater the averages amongst that people group of self-harm, of depression, and of suicide. The leading cause of death in North American adults under 50, more than cancer and heart disease, is self-harm related deaths. The leading cause. Between 1999 and 2014, suicide rates amongst middle-aged men rose 43%. And amongst women, it was 63%. This is despite living in an age of advanced knowledge, societal progress, and huge innovation. Yet despite all of this, we find ourselves sadder and more hopeless than ever. It's not what we would expect. Society tells us that if we pursue this, live this way, achieve these things, your life will be better. And what we're discovering in mass levels is the opposite is true. That something that we are being asked to live within is making our lives worse. 24-hour news, cable TV, and all of these connections we have on social media, it's hard to avoid this constant, relentless message that this is what your life should look like. This is how well you should be doing. So we end up with a new word, or rather a new usage of an old word creeping into our vocabulary. Perhaps you've heard people use it. You find it bumping around online and in conversation now. The word is overwhelm. I've got so much going on right now, I'm just overwhelmed. Now, the grammar fans amongst you are slightly struggling right there. That's a different seminar we'll run at another day, just called Chill Out, It's Only Language. But this sense of overwhelm, this sense of that basically things are emotionally overloading me. I can't cope with what I've got. The security that I gain from feeling in control isn't there anymore. But here's the problem. I want to feel in control, but the goals and aims and requirements that society place on me require me to push myself beyond where I'm able to be in control. So I want to be in control, but what I want is out of control. And listen, as long as we can kind of feel in control, most of the time we're okay. You know, we try not to think too hard about the fact that realistically we're all clinging to a rock hurtling through space at 67,000 miles an hour. You know, but as long as I can get a vanilla shot in my double-double, I'm in control. At least I think so. But then there's the things that I can do nothing about. And I can be kind of okay-ish about them. But if enough of them build up, if I start amassing enough things that I'm not quite sure about, that feel like I'm not quite in control of, that feel like I can't do anything about, the psychological term for these terms is stressors. If all of these things gather, then I suffer from something that we know and talk about regularly in the modern world, and that's stress. Stress is probably the biggest threat to our mental well-being in our contemporary society. And we all experience it. Those moments of reduced personal control where the fight or flight instinct in our brain starts to dump adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormone, into our system. There's nothing inherently bad about stress, by the way. When you encounter a really scary dog, the stress keeps you alive, right? It's the fight or flight mechanism that decides, don't pet it. Okay, and that's why you still have a hand. Or perhaps in some traffic situation that goes a little out of control, it's that stress cortisol that helps you make those decisions in quicker times than you normally are able to make decisions. But if you live in a context where this stress hormone is happening intensely or perhaps regularly, the effects of the brain start to become easily identifiable. We can all spot a stressed person. We can sometimes spot ourselves as a stressed person. We realize that our behavior starts to tweak. We start doing things that don't ordinarily form part of our behavioral processes. We find ourselves more temper-driven. We find ourselves in harder situations to think straightly. All these sort of strange things happen to us as these hormones are working their way through our bodies. And yet, despite all of that, we kind of talk about stress glibly. You know, sometimes an alternate answer to "how are you?" busy is stressed. I'm a little stressed at the moment. And we say phrases like a little stressed, but you know, it takes your body between 20 and 60 minutes to get all of that adrenaline and cortisol back under control after you've been through a stressing situation. And it's tiring. Like all you're aware of is that rushing need to go to the bathroom. But your body's fighting and working to normalize things. And here's the thing, if the stress becomes common, if the stress becomes regular, or is just too intense, well, Andrew Solomon puts it like this. Once you've had a stress sufficient to cause a protracted increase of your cortisol levels, your cortisol system is damaged. And in the future, it will not readily turn off once it has been activated. So the physical and mental consequences of stress become normal for you. Because your body struggles to get everything back under control, it's easier for it just to live there. Which is why you find yourself sometimes in that kind of permanent twitchy state. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe that person looks at you in the mirror on a regular basis. We find ourselves twitchy sometimes, and it's basically because all of the constant living with stress, that, hey, I'm just a little stressed, has actually started to adjust who we are. For many, then, the ability to switch off or counter that stress internally means we start to seek external relief. We start to go outside of ourselves to figure out how to control how we feel. This invariably makes things worse. We call this the stress cycle. And this is where your attempt to alleviate your stress actually causes more stress, which results in further attempts to alleviate your stress, which results in, you get the picture. So let's say you work for a boss, and the boss asks something of you that is more than reasonable. You don't have much control over this. It's difficult to negotiate with bosses sometimes. And so you try, but and it's stressful being given more work than you feel you can do. You try and negotiate with your boss. They don't hear it. So this creates more stress. And you end up working longer and harder to try and achieve what is asked of you, which creates more stress. After not so long, you find yourself living in a place of chronic stress. But that's just normal for you. So what do? Well, you don't have much time anymore. So the quality of food you eat starts to drop. You find yourself dwelling on a junk food diet because that's all I've got time for, right? Because that's just the way it is in the modern world. And then a lot of us, particularly in Western society, have found a solution to lots of stress, and it comes in bottle form. The problem is alcohol is a depressant, so we're already beginning to mess with our psyche at some level in that. And what essentially ends up happening is our health and our mental state become affected. That then stresses us out even more, making you more vulnerable to stress, and so the cycle continues. And yet, for many of us, we don't see stress as a mental health issue. It's just the way life is, right? Interestingly, the stressed brain of a rat, and I know humans are not rats, well, apart from that guy at work, but I know humans are not rats, but a lot of times we do experiments there first, right? The stressed brain of a rat looks remarkably similar to the depressed brain of a rat, which makes some of you think, well, what have a rat got to be depressed about? But let's cover that again in another seminar. But stress is acknowledged as a driving cause in the rise of depression in our society. So, and then think about this. If I told you that one of the things we know is that the more stress that you find yourself under, this does actually physically start to alter your physiology and even your genetics. Experiments have been done and know that the offspring of stressed mammals are more stressed than they should be. So the implications of this are wider, and yet we fail to take it seriously. Stress has become just something we say. And admittedly, some people are more stressed than other people. And the line between stressed and too stressed is hard to see. Where is it? And at what point does stressed become too stressed? But one of the things we know is that stress causes issues like depression and anxiety. And the other problem is that anxiety and depression generate stress, which is a really vicious cycle to find yourself in. But what interests me amongst all of that is also this. We know that work adjustments, improved health and lifestyle, slowing down, speaking to a therapist, these things all help. And yet, we choose to keep going. We choose to just ignore that and keep pretending that this is just what life is like. Because that may be true of everyone else, but I can keep going all the time. And I can cope with it. And I can just deal with it. The question I want to ask is, why do we think that? Where does that pressure come from? I want to frame and encapsulate that in a word this morning. And the word is should. The overwhelm of the should in modern life. Some people call it performancism. But the power of the should is that we always feel the pressure to be doing better or doing more. So that there's no day in which we find ourselves in the place that we can let go of that relentless urge that we should be doing something. We should always be about something. We should always be producing something. We should always be achieving something. We should always be getting somewhere that we're not currently. And our work life becomes unbearable. Our social lives are lived in constant comparison. We install apps on our phone to help us live our social lives in constant comparison. Our recreational choices, let's be honest for a moment, our recreational choices, if offered to many of our ancestors, they wouldn't take salary to do the things we call time off. Run for fun? But our worth has become tied to the should. Our worth has become tied to what we should be. If we're not doing something, if we're not achieving something, if we're not getting better, then what's your value? What's your worth? How can you hold your head up if you're not progressing? If you're not doing something more exciting than the other person? Don't believe me? Let's get involved in an experiment. Decide this year to vacation at home. I realize that doesn't go down well in Calgary, all right? Decide to vacation at home. Tell your friends you're going to vacation at home. See how they start to ask questions. Maybe they won't ask them to your face. Maybe they'll ask them behind your back. Hey, I wonder if they're going through some challenges. I wonder if they've got financial problems. I wonder if things aren't going so well for them right now. Because nobody would voluntarily choose to slow down that much that they stayed at home. And how would you feel about yourself if all of a sudden the comparison levels between what everybody else is doing, you are not able to join in? How would you feel? How would people respond? And this is because these stressors, our jobs, our social lives, our recreation, become markers of our value, perceptions of what we should be doing, performancism. Or if I can be cheeky as a scholar for a moment, what St. Paul would call justification according to works of the law. That sense that we can earn our place in the world, that we can earn it, achieve it, and it'll make us who we're supposed to be. The problem is, and St. Paul knew this well, you can't satisfy the should. You can't achieve everything you need to achieve. You can't hit the level that will make you happy. David Zahl says it like this: ask the most successful person you know, and you'll likely hear a tale of standards and expectations that are not so much assuaged as exaggerated by achievement. Here's the weird thing. When you actually get to what you think you should be, it's not as satisfying as you thought, because there's just more stuff that you realize you could be. The problem is the pursuit of the should makes it difficult for us to accept the is. Makes it difficult for us to just accept that this is the way things are sometimes. And that's okay. Because we've been taught not to accept it. We've been taught not to question what the pursuit of this far-off goal might actually do to us. And while we've been taught that and tried to live it out, the stress of the should is killing us, literally. The pain of being less than we think we should be for many of us is just unbearable. So we put ourselves through all sorts of stresses to try and achieve what we think we should be so that we can walk around in our society in the way that we think we're supposed to. And it doesn't work just to dismiss this as, well, that's just how life in Calgary is. Because there's somebody going, that's just how life in Toronto is. And there's somebody else going, that's just how life in New York is. And eventually we have to sit back and realize there's probably something a little wrong with us, that we can't just step away from it all. So what do we do? Let me give you a bit of a personal confession. I am a lifelong perfectionist. It's a problem. I really detest the notion that I have personal limitations. You know this about me. I've talked enough to you over the last year or so. Exhibit 1. I'm not really as fit as I'd like to be, and I'm absolutely terrified of bears. But my hobby since I've come here is running in the Canadian Rockies. Like, what is that about? It kills me, it hurts, and most of the time I'm just terrified for my life, which is the only reason I keep running. I'm not smart enough to run with people slower than me, which is, because you know the rule, right? You don't need to be faster than a bear, just faster than the person you're running with. Doesn't feel very pastoral, that, though, I'm also a fortunate person in a slightly twisted way, in that I do also know where too stressed is in my own life. I talked to you a little bit about this last year towards the end of my doctoral research, which when I was writing up my dissertation, I was also teaching at a seminary in the UK. I also was director of 5 of their degree programs that they had, as well as pastoring on a team at my local church. Not to mention, we started a family in the midst of all of this. And somewhere in there, I felt like I hit a bit of a wall. I say with surprise. I explained this a little bit last year, and you can listen to that podcast if you want to. But for me, the wall presented itself in kind of overwhelming anxiety and the beginnings of some depression. So my first meeting with my therapist, I talked her through my life. And she said, what do you do? I talked her through it, and she said, so why are you here? I said, I think I'm a little bit stressed. She said, I know people whose hearts would give out before they got to what you call a little bit stressed. But somewhere along the line, like the slow boil of a frog, this stress just becomes normal, and you just try and live with it, and you convince yourself that you're able to do that. And so when the therapist says, you probably need to slow down, you probably need to rest, you maybe need to stop doing some of those things, that was exactly not what I was paying her to say. I wanted, but you are an exceptional person and able to keep doing this. But that's not what I got. Now, why is it that our attempts to prove something to someone, and I don't know who that someone is, by the way, it's not God. I know that theologically. It's not God that we're trying to prove it to. He doesn't need that. But something drives so many of us to prove something to someone that we just accept the stress, the overwhelm, and then the physiological challenge that brings and the mental health issues that we find ourselves living in. I said last year that I wasn't a psychologist, and I haven't become one in the last year, so that's still true. But I do have a story that is within my realm of expertise that I want to share with you this morning. Not to cure, but perhaps to care. In Mark chapter 1, you thought I was going to Romans there. In Mark chapter 1 and verse 32, the writer says this: that evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. This sounds like a busy day. That evening after sunset is a kind of biblical writer's way of saying, this is kind of beyond reasonable. The working day's finished, and people are still bugging Jesus. I don't know about you. Casting out demons sounds tiring. Right? It's not my area of expertise, but it sounds like you would probably need a little sit down afterwards. And healing various diseases sounds stressful. I don't know if anybody's come to you and said, my uncle's sick, can you do something about it? That sounds like that could cause some stress. And dealing with the expectations of the whole town is undoubtedly stressful. How would you respond? What would you do? How would you cope with this? All of these stressors are lining up in your life. What does Jesus do? Does he get caught up in the should? I should do something for these people. I'm Jesus, after all. I should get involved in helping this. The very next verse says this: very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they explained, everyone is looking for you. In the face of all of the expectation, the demands, the stressors, possible overwhelm, Jesus steps away and prays. People who participate in a religious gathering once per week between 1996 and 2010 were categorized as 5 times less likely to commit suicide. What is it about prayer? What is it about stepping into the presence of God that sometimes changes things? Pause, rest, take a breath, stop, spend time with your Creator. Jesus perhaps does what a good psychologist would tell you to do. Get away from it. Get away from the things that would make demands of you. Make the change. Don't get caught up in the overwhelm of should. Give up on pursuing the Pinterest-worthy life that might kill you. And instead, Jesus finds himself in a place of prayer. But still the stressors come. Everybody's looking for you. Everybody's got something for you to do, Jesus. But Jesus replies, let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. Sometimes we say we're too busy to rest. Sometimes we've been taught that our results-oriented culture demands that we don't have time to rest. But rest not only steps us away from the things which stress us, which is perhaps unsurprising that God was the inventor of the day off, by the way. Rest allows Jesus to step away from all of the demands and remember what his purpose is. For this is why I have come. You can't live in your purpose. You can't live in your calling. You can't live in what God has called you to be if you never stop. If you buy into the lie that you can always keep going because there's always something you should be doing, the risk is not just that you'll die. The risk is that you won't be able to live in the purpose that God called you to. Rest requires some intentionality. It is countercultural to our results world. It's seen as weakness by some. But the message of the gospel of peace and grace is that some things happen even when we're not trying. Some of us will still need medication. Some of us will need to change our lives. Some of us need to practice rest more intentionally. All of those things are better if we also lean on God. He might not take those things away, but he will journey with us through them. And I believe the grace found in the gospel calls us away from striving and into restful presence, into a presence of a God who pours his unearned grace on you and invites you to remember that stressed isn't how he intended you to live. So I want to invite you to take communion with us this morning. But I want to ask you just to stay in your seats. I sometimes think communion is best experienced passively. Our servers are going to come. They're going to start serving you just at this moment. And I want you to remember as you are served communion, without even getting up, that everything that Jesus did for you was entirely passive on your part. He did it for you before you, he did it for you in advance of you, and he did it for you without you. And in our world of chaos and stress and difficulty, perhaps as we take communion passively this morning, we remember that the world may stay the same for the time being, but Jesus is still here to support us and guide us and carry us through those times. So Heather leads us in song. I invite you just to receive communion as it's given to you. We started this morning with a text from Romans that offered peace in the midst of suffering. And I pray for you all this morning that in our lives of stress, with all the damage that it can do to our brains, our bodies, our whole lives, that we might welcome God's restful, countercultural peace into our lives, remembering that he, and only he in this world, loves you for who you are and not what you think you should be. May God's grace and peace be with you this week.